As we all know, COVID-19 is one of the natural pandemics that has brought the whole world to its knees. Approximately 259 million people worldwide have contracted COVID-19, and around 5.17 million deaths have been caused by this terrible virus. However, when it comes to persistence and the devastating consequences it has inflicted on humanity, COVID-19 still pales in comparison to another pandemic that once ravaged mankind in the past. Of course, all comparisons are imperfect, as they depend on various factors such as differences in medical conditions, economic situations, and societal contexts in each era. Nevertheless, this pandemic remains one of the most terrifying disasters humanity has ever known, one that no other catastrophe can yet match. Its name is the Black Death. In the early 14th century, Europe was struck by a plague known as the Black Death. It swept across the continent, becoming the most destructive pandemic in human history at the time. The cause of this disease was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which was only discovered in 1894 by the French physician Alexander Yersin. This tiny organism wiped out 60% of Europe's population at the time, leading to the destruction of many cities and causing the average life expectancy of the population to drop from 40 to just 20 years. The Black Death broke out in Europe from 1347 to 1351. It was a rapidly spreading infectious disease with devastating destructive power. It is said that it was introduced from the Middle East and brought in by Genoese merchant ships in 1347. At first, it struck southern Italy, then quickly spread to Spain and France. In 1348, it was introduced to the Kingdom of England from Normandy, France, and by 1350, it had reached Russia. The Black Death brought immense losses to the people of Europe. In many densely populated cities, the mortality rate exceeded 50%. In several places, corpses were piled onto carts like garbage. According to historical records, Florence lost 40,000 people in the disaster of 1348, while both Venice and London each saw 100,000 deaths. It is estimated that the Black Death claimed the lives of over 24 million Europeans. The average life expectancy in Europe also dropped from 40 years to just 20. The first major impact of mass death on the European economy was a severe labor shortage. According to estimates by Western scholars, the workforce in Europe decreased by 25% at the time. Due to the extreme lack of labor, livestock were left unattended in the fields, and there was no one to harvest the crops. The second economic impact was a shift in the agricultural structure. With labor shortages driving up costs, the expenses for growing and cultivating grain became enormous, leading to low profitability. As a result, a large number of farmers abandoned their land and turned to a new industry, livestock farming. Farmlands turned into pastures, and grain cultivation was replaced by sheep farming. Sheep farming evolved from primitive nomadic herding in the mountains to fixed pastures. The livestock industry expanded into the plains, and the wool industry complemented sheep farming, developing simultaneously and becoming a pioneering industry in Europe from the Middle Ages to modern society. The third impact of the Black Death on Europe's economy was the rise and fall of urban economies. Taking Florence, the fastest-growing economic city at the time, as an example, let's look at the full picture. Before the plague ravaged the city, the lively scene of Florence was vividly described by the 14th-century poet Antonio Pucci. All the food produced in the Tuscan countryside could be found in the market: various seasonal vegetables, fruits, all kinds of meat, fish, and game, as well as many other delicacies. After the plague struck, the entire city became desolate. The fastest and most direct impact of the disease was that shops and workshops had to shut down. Only a few clinics and pharmacies remained open in the panic-stricken city. The entire city resembled a massive hospital and funeral home. The economic crisis caused by the Black Death undoubtedly contributed to a series of uprisings among the lower classes, both in urban and rural areas, between 1350 and 1450. According to historical records, the number of revolts during this period reached an unprecedented level. One of the most far-reaching indirect consequences of the Black Death was the Great Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Due to the widespread devastation of the Black Death, labor shortages became severe. Peasants were able to negotiate with the nobility from a position of strength, as the demand for labor increased. At the same time, they could demand higher wages and lower land rents. However, the noble lords were determined not to compromise and used their power to force workers into labor. A royal decree on June 18, 1349, required all able-bodied individuals to work and maintain the wage levels of 1346. The decree of 1351 reinforced this regulation and introduced additional details. In 1381, the English nobility imposed a poll tax, which was levied per person rather than based on wealth. This created even greater social injustice. As a result, class tensions escalated, culminating in a famous peasant uprising in history. Although the revolt ended in failure, the nobility was ultimately forced to make a series of concessions. In reality, peasants' wages increased and land rents were significantly reduced. Moreover, the gradual abolition of the oppressive feudal serfdom system in the Middle Ages played a crucial role in Europe's transition into modern society. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Black Death reshaped the political landscape of Europe. Peasant revolts throughout history have been an external manifestation of social transformation and a direct driving force for social progress. This was especially true in Europe, where the Black Death played a significant role. In fact, the social upheavals and political changes brought about by the Black Death directly led to the decline of the nobility's influence and the rise of the bourgeois class. Although the noble lords ultimately succeeded in suppressing popular uprisings, they could not escape the sharp decline in their land-based income. Due to the devastation of the Black Death, labor became extremely scarce, and wages for hired workers increased significantly, despite the government's attempts to impose legal restrictions on wages. However, the dynamics of labor supply and demand overcame these barriers. Workers became increasingly aware of their value, and noble landlords had to offer competitive wages to attract labor to maintain their estates. At the same time, land rents dropped considerably. In contrast, merchants and financiers in the cities were able to recover quickly from the disaster. With the strength and favorable conditions for urban development, they swiftly amassed wealth. The economic decline inflicted severe damage on the old aristocracy, as they were directly affected by disruptions in production. Their status weakened significantly, and they were no longer able to hold key positions in government and the state. Many prominent businessmen and politicians began to enter various governmental institutions, securing important positions. On multiple occasions, they even became key decision-makers in government. Thus, while the emergence of the Black Death was a catastrophic event for human society, it indirectly strengthened the bourgeoisie economically, administratively, and socially. It created opportunities and provided the necessary foundation for the eventual rise of the bourgeois revolution. The Black Death weakened the stability of European culture. The persistently high mortality rate reduced the number of scholars and intellectuals, diminishing the expressive capacity of the original culture. After the Black Death, Europe faced challenges in maintaining and restoring its cultural heritage. This crisis significantly affected educational institutions, particularly universities, as the epidemic led to a sharp decline in student enrollment. The number of students at the University of Oxford dropped from 30,000 before the outbreak to only 6,000 by the late 14th century. Before 1348, there were about 30 universities in Europe, but 5 had to shut down completely after the Black Death. The plague also reduced the number of clergy, while religious ceremonies, especially funerals, created an immense demand for priests. Since universities were the primary institutions for priestly training, this social demand became a driving force for the expansion of universities. Furthermore, as travel was considered dangerous during the epidemic, the establishment of local universities allowed students to stay closer to home, reducing the risk of infection. The rise of new universities weakened the dominance of traditional cultural centers. Young scholars were encouraged to explore new fields of study, leading to the emergence and development of new academic ideas. This undermined the international unity of medieval European culture and paved the way for the fragmentation of the theological system. At the same time, a reform movement took shape within universities, marked by a revival of interest in classical studies. Thus, the Black Death in medieval Europe created opportunities for the flourishing of the European Renaissance. Although the Black Death caused immense suffering for the people of England, it also heightened awareness of the devastating impact of epidemics and the importance of studying diseases such as the plague. People began to pay greater attention to the advancement of higher education and the development of medical sciences and technology. For example, in the 5 years following the outbreak, 3 new colleges were founded at the University of Cambridge in 1348: Trinity College, Corpus Christi College, and Clare College. The emergence of new academic institutions weakened the dominance of theological education in English universities, which had been prevalent since the Middle Ages. To some extent, skepticism toward Christianity contributed to the rise of Anglicanism, liberating human thought from religious constraints and laying the ideological foundation for the development of the English bourgeois revolution. The Black Death further exacerbated the polarization between the rich and the poor in medieval European society. The lives of the poor became even more difficult as the upper class tightened its control over the lower class to maintain its political and economic status, intensifying social conflicts. Desperate poor people moved away in search of new jobs, or at least some material assistance. More and more cities and towns became temporary shelters for migrating poor people, forcing them to seek whatever means necessary to survive. The growing population of impoverished individuals became an increasingly unstable social factor, threatening social life and order at the time. Society plunged into crisis, and resistance or violence could erupt at any moment. The poor became increasingly aware that their interests were fundamentally at odds with those of the wealthy. Ideas of social equality and personal freedom began to spread among the lower classes, planting the seeds of future revolutions. The Black Death also accelerated the division between different groups in medieval European society: the healthy and the sick, the cultural mainstream and marginalized groups, foreigners, beggars, and Jews. These divisions had complex and harmful effects on society, disrupting the existing social order and weakening the ability of society to regulate itself. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share to support us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you for watching until the end.